when we're getting tired of winter, which usually happens around middle of March or April. I mean, there's Airbnbs all over the place. So I think we're gonna do that. So this trip has already changed my life. I'm not sure if it's gonna change your life, but it's already changed my life. I'll give you a little bit of my background. I'm really old. I've been teaching. The teaching that I did was close to 30 years of classroom teaching and a principal in New York City, in Harlem, of a K-8 school, and an assistant principal. I'm so old, they had these things called junior highs. How many people remember junior highs? You know, what is in New York City is called 3,000 children all going through puberty at the same time in the same place. That's how you define a junior high in New York City. And I began teaching about, as I said, close to 40 years ago when I went to college in the University of Wisconsin in Madison. Taught in a rural school, really rural, like Mr. from Wisconsin?
Wisconsin, Oshkosh.
Oshkosh, huh? You escaped though. That's another place that has very long winters. I taught 1 year in place in New Glarus, Wisconsin, a very rural school like Mr. Liben. I would have liked to have done my homework, but my dad got drunk and I had to milk the cows. Got homesick for New York City. Could not figure out how to get a job in the New York City public school system. It was just too bizarre. And so applied to private schools where it's like the real world. You write a letter, you send your resume, and you get an interview. And ended up teaching for 7 years in elite private day schools. Schools that charge, that tuition now is like $45,000 or $50,000 a year. Finally, the system changed a little, and I found a way to apply to schools, and I ended up going to a school in Harlem that was designed for kids who were unmotivated, and if not being thrown out of other schools, on the verge of being thrown out of other schools. It was called the sports school. The idea being that sports would motivate kids to work harder and to behave themselves, which was an idea that the founder of the school later called fallacious at best and racist at worst. Apparently putting all the kids who are unmotivated in the same school didn't work. But in many ways it was a nice place, but they really was not great academics. And it was a long way from the elite private schools that I was used to. And I worked there for a number of years and became an assistant director, and then started public school with my wife and another teacher. The three of us were teachers, and as I said, I'm so freaking old, there was no such thing as charter schools then. This was a new public school, a K-8 school. And we started out with really very poor reading scores, and we changed. We made a number of changes that will be embedded in what I'm going to talk to you about today. And our reading scores started to go up. Wait, reading scores don't go up right away. That doesn't work for a variety of reasons. But over a number of years, our reading scores went up. We had about 134% free and reduced price lunch. So the chancellor of the New York City school system, who worked with a consulting company, pro bono, sent the person from that consulting company called McKinsey Consulting to see how did this school that had all low-income children and was a neighborhood-based school, how did their reading scores keep going up? And so that person called me and said, would you speak to a group of principals for an hour? This was the representative, the guy who was working with the chancellor from McKinsey Consulting, a big fancy consulting company. And I said, no, I won't, because I can't do anything in an hour. And unfortunately, especially at that time, things have changed a little. Principals didn't know much about literacy. But he was a very persistent person, and he said, well, can I come speak to you? He actually came up to my apartment in the Bronx, where I lived, biking distance from Yankee Stadium. You could probably tell I'm not from Vermont, where I live now. I'm from Brooklyn. And he spent the day with me, and then he came to our school. He learned all about our curriculum. And that person was David Coleman, who's one of the three primary architects of the standards. And so myself and my wife have worked with David Coleman ever since then, and that was about 25 years ago. So I'm not considered a writer of the standards, which is fine. I don't need my face on various dartboards across America. I don't need to be a Tea Party favorite. So I'm not a writer of the standards. The first drafter is on my computer, which is somewhere in this room, over there. But my primary, I did help write them, but my primary work was to synthesize the research for ELA literacy that went into the standards, and also with my wife to do the research that determined, well, since now complexity is the standard, then well, what's complex text in 3rd grade? What's complex text in the 5th grade? That had never been done before. And so we did the research project that determined what the Lexile levels are. And there's more than one way to measure text complexity, but Lexile seems to dominate the market. So we did the research that determined what's the Lexile for 5th grade, what's the Lexile for 7th grade. So that's my primary work. And since then, David Coleman started a not-for-profit, Student Achievement Partners. And since then, I've been working with Student Achievement Partners. Most of my work is with publishers to work on materials for the standards, states, districts, organizations such as TNTP, large charter networks, a lot of review. I review a lot of online curriculum. I review published commercial curriculum. Student Achievement Partners takes no money from publishers, so anything we do for publishers is for free, because if you start taking money from publishers and you say it's really good, people are going to be a little suspicious. Of course, if you take money from them and you say it's shit, they really do believe it. But nevertheless, we don't take any money from publishers. So that's an introduction to me. We're going to talk about some things that are an approach to the whole problem of these standards and how to deal with our children with raised standards, especially our children who are behind and have been behind. And the ideas are going to be a lot different in some of the things, in many ways, not always, different than some of the things you've been thinking or doing. So it's very important that if you don't understand something, that you please ask, or if you disagree with me about something, or at least you're not quite comfortable with it, ask, because I find for sure, I do this a lot, but if these disagreements always, no matter what happens, you may convince me, or I may convince you, or we may not convince each other, but it's always a learning experience. It's a learning experience for me for sure. So if there's something you don't understand, or if there's something that you disagree with, please say it. That's important. So, any questions so far? Did I piss off anybody yet? Okay. So let's go. There's 3 shifts. How many people have seen these shifts? Important to just go over them for a second. Since you've seen them all, we'll just go complexity, regular practice with complex text, and it's academic language. Academic language, by the way, means vocabulary and syntax, not just vocabulary. Evidence, reading, writing, and speaking grounded in evidence from the text, and knowledge, building knowledge through content-rich nonfiction. So those are the 3 shifts. And did I miss something? No. Let's take a look at why for each. Why the focus on text complexity? How many people are familiar with that first study, Between the Lines, 2006? This is a really interesting study. The American College Testing Service, what do most kids do here? Do they take the SAT or the ACT, mostly in Florida?
ACTs.
Mostly ACTs?
Well, it's probably 50-50, but most kids I know are taking ACT now.
So the ACT did something very interesting. They wanted to see, okay, which of our kids, and it's about 600,000 kids, take the ACT. What score, what do you have to, is there a benchmark? And above that benchmark score, if a kid gets it, they do well in college. So they found a benchmark, I believe it was 21 out of the 36 questions. Is that right? They may have changed it because this study was 2006. You think it was,
I think 21's low, like you have to have 26 to get bright futures.
okay, so maybe it's 26.
I'm all about the ACT right now.
But above that benchmark, they found that students who scored above that benchmark were far more likely to get B or better in their first 2 years of college, were far more likely to stay in the same college. By the way, you're going to get this PowerPoint, so one way or the other, right, Vanessa?
Yes.
So, I mean, welcome to take notes, but you will get the PowerPoint. Kids who scored above the benchmark were more likely to get B or better in their first year, any courses, social sciences or humanities or literature type classes. They were more likely to graduate from the same college. They were more likely to graduate in 4 years, and independent of income level or ethnicity. So what they then did was, all right, let's look at the questions. Let's look at the kinds of questions that the kids got right who scored above the benchmark, compared to the kids who got wrong, or below, who scored below the benchmark. So the first thing we always look for in the lit world is what type of questions? Questions that involve inferencing in some way or another, that are not literal questions or not right there questions. Turns out there was no difference. The kids who scored above the benchmark and the kids who scored below the benchmark did the same on the inference questions. So let's fine tune them more. Let's look at central idea questions or theme questions, because that's important. We talk about central idea or theme beginning in kindergarten, and we're still talking about it 13 years later in 12th grade. Didn't make a difference. Kids who scored below the benchmark on the central idea questions did no better or no worse than kids who scored above the benchmark. Well, so inference, central idea, theme, well, what about vocabulary and context? No difference. What about authors following an argument or evaluating an author's argument? No difference. So evaluating an author's argument, determining a theme, determining a central idea, vocabulary and vocabulary and context, none of the types of questions seem to make any difference whatsoever. So what made the difference? What made the difference was the complexity of the passage. On the passages that were most complex, the kids who scored below the benchmark got about 25% right. Now, I haven't taught math in a while, but there's 4 choices. So if you're getting 25% right, that's just chance. That's just guessing. On the most complex text, the kids who scored below the benchmark might as well have been reading Mandarin Chinese. They had no idea what was going on the complex passages. So what's the upshot of that? It turns out that the best predictor of success in college is not whether you understand theme, not whether you understand main idea, not whether you understand sequence, not whether you understand argument, not whether you understand central idea. It turns out that the biggest predictor of success in college, regardless of your income level and regardless of your ethnicity, is can you read complex text independently and proficiently, which is what standard? Standard 10. And that's why that standard is what it is. And it's the most important standard. That's why the Common Core standards emphasize complex text. That's one reason. The other reason was in doing the research, and this was a lot of my research, we found out that the complexity level of K-12 texts has decreased nearly over the last century, to the point where students in the mid-1990s, in the 11th grade, were reading text comparable in complexity to what 7th graders were reading in 1961. Students in the mid-1990s, in the 11th grade, were reading text comparable in complexity to what 7th graders were reading in 1961. So the complexity of text has been declining for at least a half a century. So that's another reason why complexity is emphasized. Third reason, when we analyze the complexity of college and career-ready texts, and I'm not talking about what they're reading in Harvard, in all colleges, and including community colleges, we analyze the complexity of the text used in college freshman classes and for businesses, like instructional manuals, business orientation documents, training manuals. We analyzed the complexity of all those texts and compared it to the complexity of the text in the 12th grade. And it turns out the gap was 4 years. In other words, what we were asking our kids to read in the first year of college was 4 years more complex on average than what we were asking them to read in 12th grade. Now this does not count advanced placement, because don't forget, advanced placement is technically not high school. That's college. It's made by a college board. It's supposed to be college. But when you look at what 12th graders were reading, it was 4 years less complex. So we're asking our kids to make a 4-year leap from June, when they graduate from high school, to when they go not just to college, but to some kind of career. So for all those reasons, the Common Core standards emphasizes complex text. And that's why Standard 10 is the ability to read complex text independently and proficiently. not to read complex text with our support, which is what we have to do when we're teaching it, but the goal is for them to read it on their own, independently, which we're going to get back to. Any questions so far? Or any disagreements or anything? Don't hesitate. If I upset you, tell me. Okay. Why the focus on evidence? Well, since the mid-1990s, questions in basal readers and questions in guided, the Fontes and Pinnell guided reading series have overwhelmingly emphasized how you feel about something, your personal response. If you look at the basals, and you're all familiar with the basals made before the Common Core, the culminating assignment, the kids read passage, they answer some questions, they do an assignment. The culminating assignment was always a connection to yourself, always. The college and career ready standards. Once you go to college, you're very rarely asked to write about your personal response to something. I mean, it happens, but not that much. And when you go into business, it's very rare, as my friend and former boss David Coleman would say, that you're asked by your administrator to write a please submit a 12-page report explaining the decline in sales over the last 2 years period, followed by a compelling account of your early childhood experiences. That very rarely happens. Yet, if you look at K-12, personal writing was a huge part. And I'm not saying we should never have personal writing or personal responses to it. But that dominated education. So that's why we shift. That's why now the focus on evidence. The third reason, we've become an evidence-free society. You can get up and say whatever the hell you want. And people don't say, well, what's your evidence for that? So those are some of the reasons why the focus on knowledge. Here's Anchor Standard 10. Read and comprehend complex literary and informational text independently and proficiently. One of the things we're going to talk about and deal with today is, it turns out that to do that, to read complex text independently and proficiently, there's a very close connection to the knowledge you have. So those are the reasons for the focus on these three literacy chips. Of course, the other possible reason is it's all part of a communist Islamicist conspiracy designed by Bill Gates and Barack Obama. That's the other possibility here. But the evidence for that tends to be rather scarce.
You're in Florida, though.
What was that?
You're in Florida.
Okay. I've also been in Georgia. All right. It's 5 essential studies. The Hernandez study in 2001, called Double Jeopardy. This was a stunning study done under the auspices of the Annie Casey Foundation. They found that 3rd graders who failed the reading test were 400% more likely to drop out of high school. Low income 3rd graders who failed the reading test were 400% more likely to drop out of high school. That's a stunning statistic. Stunning. Lesnick and al., a study done in Chicago in 2010 with roughly 60,000 students. 3rd grade reading scores predicted 9th grade reading scores, predicted SAT or ACT scores, predicted your chance of going to college, predicted basically everything. And that was not just for low-income students. Fletcher and Lyon, 74% of 3rd graders who read poorly will still be struggling in 9th grade. Snow and all, Catherine Snow, 1998, a person who is not at least, this is a quote, at least a modestly skilled reader by the end of 3rd grade is quite unlikely to graduate from high school. That's 1998, 17 years ago. Connie Jewell, 1988, roughly over 25 years ago. 1st grade reading scores are a reliable predictor of later reading scores. Now I'm going to ask you to do a turn-in talk to address these questions. Why? Yes?
I think it's foundational skills and that we don't teach multi-syllabic word syllabation.
Which was a part of foundational skills.
Right.
And of course that would fit, not kind of fit, that, you know, kind of pregnant. That would fit because the data is in the third grade, and the third grade test does not just measure what goes on in the third grade, it measures what goes on in K1 and 2. And I think we'll see that that's absolutely a part of this. Early education, K1 and 2, I don't think it gets the attention it deserves in general, but it's absolutely not getting the attention it deserves with the Common Core standards. With the idea that we're not only asking children now to answer more rigorous questions, but we're asking them to read texts that are 2, 3, and at the high school level, we're asking them to read texts that are as much as 4 years above what we asked them to read before. But they were behind before, so now they're more behind. And a lot of that, as we'll see, comes from foundational skills, and the foundational skills don't get the attention. It's an intriguing question why they don't get the attention.
These books, question number 2, the idea that we're asking teachers to cover so much in the curriculum, they don't have time to go deep. And so the kids don't get the deep understanding of skills, and then they go to the next level. They haven't mastered the deep skills, so we have to spend time reteaching, which only exacerbates that.
So there's too much going on, and so a skill doesn't get learned before we move on to the next skill, which is kind of, for foundational skills, that works completely. Be interesting to see. It doesn't work quite the same way with the non-foundational standards, but it definitely does with foundation. Anything else from this group? Yes?
I was just wondering, when the shifts came at just trying to parallel it to math, how they said they were going to start taking so many skills and not trying to push them down into kindergarten, first and second, and really spend a solid kindergarten, first grade years with a number sense and understanding, and then introducing more like, I think it was Sweden did, you know, that study that they talked about where why did they do so great in math all of a sudden? It was because they only spent the first year talking about what is a number.
Right.
How do I make a 5? You know, those kind of things. Are they trying to do the same thing with the ELA standards, or are they still saying you need to know how to do informational text? You need to know how to do entertainment text, or just the different types of reading that you have to do and be able to respond to it? Are they trying to break that apart a little more, or are they just continually saying every year you have to cover every subject or every type of reading?
That's a really good point, and the analogy to the math is interesting. I think that the question becomes, are we taking the standards and are we teaching one standard deeply? I mean, in reading, for example, and in writing, in reading there's only 10 standards per grade. Now there's speaking and listening and there's language, but in reading there's 10 standards. If you think about your state standards before the Common Core, there were way more than 10 standards. So that, and the same with, then there's only 9 writing standards. So if you think about your standards before the Common Core, there were way more. So the standard should address that, but what happens is if you take the standard, if you take standard 1, or any standard, and break it up into 8 substandards, then you're going right back.
Back to where you were at the beginning.
And to back to the beginning, which I think that's happening. That doesn't explain this data, because for reasons that we'll say in a minute, but I do think that that's happening. If you take the standards and you break them up, which a lot of people do, I mean, some professional developers come and they take the 10 reading standards and they literally make it into over 50 different substandards. And then they teach substandard 1A, 1B, 1C, 1D. And then what's the point? One of the ideas behind the standards was fewer, clearer, and higher. So that's number 1. And number 2, there's no evidence. If you take something and you break it into 10 parts, and then you take the next standard and break it into 10 parts, and you're in the 2nd grade, you're lost. The teacher's lost and the kid is lost. So I think that's happening, but it doesn't explain this data. That was good. Anything else from this group?
All right, so I teach 3rd grade, and I teach ELA all day, and I love it, okay? So I don't have a foundational skill problem at my school, and maybe it's school-based. I've got kids that could read the Wall Street Journal in my school fluently.
But don't know what the hell they're reading.
They couldn't tell you if the sun was shining. So, and all interventions in ELA seem to go back to foundational skills. So, I don't understand how it could be foundational skills.
Because,
School-based.
well,
I mean, those
when I was,
teachers are phonics masters.
right. When I have two sons, each of whom competed for who can be a bigger pain in the ass for a long time. But as we did things around the country, and they'd point out, weird things or things that you don't see in New York City. Like when you're going to a school district office in New York City, it's very rare that you see signs saying, "Please don't go in the water. There's an alligator here." And I would say to my sons when they point that out, I would say, it's a big freaking country. You don't have a foundational skills problem in your school, but others might. So that's number one. And number two, on our website that I know a lot of you have been on, Achieve the Core, there's a paper called Both And that I wrote with my wife. And what we have in education is we have people who say, well, if they get the foundational skills, if they can decode, or even if they can read fluently, then it's all going to fall into place. That's not true. And then there's other people, I happen to think, and if you're familiar with it, there's other groups, and this is kind of like the reading wars. How many people are familiar with that term, the reading wars, whole language versus phonics? There was never, that never really came to an end. I compare it to Korea. In Korea, there's no peace treaty. There's a ceasefire that's been going on for 60 years, but there's no peace treaty. There's no peace treaty with the reading wars. There are people who think that if you give kids lovely literature and get them to embellish it and surround them with it and appreciate it, then they'll get the foundational skills. That's not true. And there's people who think if they get the foundational skills, they'll be able to go on and know what they're reading. It's both and. We need a lot more both ands in our educational world rather than either ors. We have the same problem for 60 freaking years, partly because we have so many either ors. So that's a good point. Yes?
So in response to the second question, with part of our curriculum might be perpetuating these trends, could it be that our curriculum rolls out a lot of text to cover throughout the year, and teachers get in that mindset, I have to cover all of these texts and stories, but if they were fewer texts and they were specifically chosen and the standards were taught clustered based on those tests, and they had that deeper experience like Steve was talking about, that maybe teachers wouldn't have that anxiety about covering, and it would be more of like a deeper experience for them and for their
Right. I think there are many people now, and this gets back to what someone else said, that again, if you take the standards and you chop them each up into 5 or 6 substandards, and you try to cover, essentially you've made 70 or 80 standards, then you've got so much breadth that you have no depth. But I don't have any evidence that that's what caused this problem. I know that that's wrong, and I know that that's happening, but I don't know if that explains the data that shows us that 3rd grade is such a predictor of what it may be, but there's no data that shows me that. Anything else from this table? Must be something else because you were having a good time. I was going to charge you an amusement tax.
Can I ask you a question?
Certainly.
Why do they say 3rd grade? Are they not the same kids from 2nd and the same kids from 1st?
Most states don't give
Do
it.
they close the gap better during those grades? Or?
They would, but most states don't give a state. Very few states give a state test.
Okay.
And it's a hodgepodge.
Second could be 1st.
Yeah.
We're just saying 2nd.
Yeah, and you get, well, one study, the Connie Jewell study from 1988, was a 1st grade study. A researcher named Keith Stanovich, who for some reason I keep forgetting to put on the count, also found 1st grade. But there's not as much solid data with 1st grade and 2nd grade. It's a hodgepodge. Some states do dibbles, some states do PALs, some states do MAPs, some states do nothing. So it's very hard, whereas every state in 3rd grade has some, and has had for a long time. There were reading tests when I was in elementary school, shortly after the Civil War. Reading tests have been around for a long time, and so they're a much more reliable source of data. I think we were up to this table. Anything else? There must be something else. As I said, you were laughing so much. You're thinking about it, I can tell.
Well, a lot of what's been shared, we talked about. I was just thinking about the second bullet and in the kindergarten and first grade curriculum, when we assess, it's all auditory, and we've had, well, not the whole way through first grade, but at the beginning of the year, we actually have first graders asking their teachers for the text. Can you just give me the text so I can go back and look at what it says when we were assessing? I don't know why that came to mind, but I thought I see that as a barrier to really knowing what the kids know.
So what assessment is this?
A unit assessment for our curriculum.
That's all oral. So you have to do it one-to-one. Is that right?
I'm sorry?
So you have to do it one-to-one.
It's read aloud to the class.
And then,
Text.
and then,
Children then have to answer the questions. It's all auditory.
oh, but they write their answers down.
No, I usually circle.
Or they
circle
circle.
the writing, yes.
Okay. So they don't have the text in first grade in front of them.
Well, they do halfway through first grade.
Right.
We did have first graders verbalizing that they would like to have, they would prefer to have a copy of the text.
Well-
It's complex what they're being read.
Right, right. It's probably the more proficient readers who are asking for a copy of the text.
Correct, yes.
So they're probably doing fine anyway.
But frustrating, for
Yeah,
the child
yeah.
at the moment.
That's interesting. The third grade test, of course, they do have it in front of them. The first grade test that Connie Jewell used, they do have. There are first grade and second grade tests. There are reading tests where kids have it in front of them in the first grade that have been used for a long time. So that's a rather unusual, somewhat unusual. And Connie Jewell's work and Keith Stanovich's work were with first graders where they had the text in front of them. So I can see why they got frustrated, but I don't think that explains this data. And I called on you and put you on the spot. So just don't throw me in with the alligator. Next table, any responses that you want to share?
We really talked about that in the early years. That was kind of in the foundational skills of getting awareness and how it starts at birth. And our families, some families need educated to help us along with our journey with learning. But that's kind of what we really want.
Oral language, those things.
Yeah, the oral language. And the fact that kids don't get, sometimes they don't get a huge recess time or some time that they can, I think, Steve, you mentioned about how the kids just don't ever have time to debrief sometimes.
Don't ever have time to what?
Little ones need to have time. Because that oral language right there, it's happening, just that kind of relaxing, have fun. They need
Well,
a social process.
Well, we've got data from the whole country for a quarter of a century. Some of those kids, a good number of those kids had recess, especially before No Child Left Behind. There was much more recess. I'm a big fan of recess. When I went from the private schools to the public schools, I went to these 25, they had all these alternative public schools in East Harlem in New York. So there were like 20 schools. And they said, well, what school do you want to go to? And I said, well, I don't know. And they asked me, well, what are you going to miss from teaching elementary school when you go to junior high? What am I going to miss from teaching elementary school? Recess. That's how I ended up in a sports school. They have a lot of recess there. I think, though, a lot of kids had recess. But the other thing that you said, the language that kids come, how many people are familiar with the 30 million word study? The idea that kids who come from affluent homes have been spoken to 30 million words. Kids who come from far less affluent homes, and it's got nothing to do with race or income level. It's really education level of the parents, which is usually correlated with income in our country. But it's really the education level of the parents. And those kids who come from less educated families, usually correlated with income, have been spoken to 1 million words. They come in with far less vocabulary than affluent children, and far less syntax. Their sentences are shorter and choppier and more disconnected. And so that's a really important point because, well, what in our curriculum addresses that? And what in our curriculum for the last 25 years has addressed that? That's one of the things we're going to definitely get to. Anything over here that hasn't been said that you'd like to share?
We shifted to those last two bullets.
Oh, that's right, I forgot. So you got to share.
One thing that we talked about was what's not in our curriculum is just text that's complex enough and rich enough and meaningful enough to develop the academic vocabulary and the knowledge.
So texts that are rich enough to develop the academic. Now, and when we're talking about K to 2, what are we talking about? If the text, let's just start with kindergarten. If we say the texts are not rich enough, those are the texts that are used for what? Read aloud. They're not going to be able to read rich, complex text on their own in kindergarten. They're really not going to be able to read text, to get back to what you said, the text they read on their own in first grade and second grade and even third grade going to be the kind of complex language that affluent children get at home? Are those texts that they read in first and second grade on their own going to have longer sentences? Going to have more tier 2 academic words? No. And does anybody have a school where they do read alouds for an hour a day? Does anybody have a school that does read alouds for a half hour a day? I got a third of a hand over here. She's got, it's like chin level.
Not every day.
Not every day. Read aloud, and if we want these kids to come, I'm sneaking ahead to later parts of the presentation, but that's okay, it's never linear. We should be doing 60 minutes a day of rich, complex text read aloud in K 1 and 2. And it should not be when the kids come in from recess to calm them down, not that there's anything wrong with that, but the goal of read aloud is not to get everybody calm after recess. We should be doing 60 minutes of read aloud. But there's a certain type of read aloud and a certain way to do it. That's done nowhere except in the only curriculum that has 60 minutes of read aloud a day is the Engage New York CKLA curriculum, which happens to be online and free. And that's 60 minutes a day of read aloud. And the reason is exactly what you said over there. It's like what you two tables nailed it basically. They need more language and they need more vocabulary. Well, what's in our curriculum that gives them language and vocabulary? The standards by themselves don't. Skills don't. The only way you're going to get language and vocabulary in K to 2 is read aloud.
And just, I'm pretty sure, to define read aloud, that's not kindergarten teachers with the big Joy Cow books that's like, I go up the dark.
No, that's not Mrs. Wishy-Washy either. Right. That's text that should be 2 or 3 years above. You could read aloud Charlotte's Web to kindergarten. They understand life. They understand death. They understand what an animal is. You can teach them what a farm is if you happen to have kids who don't have any connection to a farm. That's the kind of text we're talking about even as early as kindergarten. They should read it themselves in third grade. They probably can't read it themselves in kindergarten. It should be read to them. No, it's not Joy Cowley. Thank you for that. I'm not a big fan of Joy Cowley. Certainly not for read aloud. Yes?
That's probably older than you.
What's that?
That's probably older.
Oh my goodness.
I do have some textbooks. I teach at a high school over in Land Lakes. I have textbooks which are pretty close to 100 years old. And you look at that same textbook addressing the same issue.
Textbooks for what grade level?
I have sophomores and juniors, IPA.
But the 100-year-old books are high school books?
Yeah, and you look at those and compare them to what we have now, and the writing that we have now has been dumbed down.
Absolutely.
The other thing, which I'm this much a believer in, I'm a huge believer in this, but nobody else believes in it. I think we've quit teaching Latin and Greek.
Our school that my wife and I started had Latin beginning in 5th grade.
Does that make
5th, 6th, how can it not? If language is important, you learn language by Latin, and the great thing about it is it's totally learnable.
Yeah.
Totally.
Not just stems and roots and all the
No.
whole
Right.
shebang, right?
I collect elementary school old textbooks, like McGuffey's Reader and so forth. You pick up these old textbooks from the 1890s, 1900s. There's no comparison. The sentences are longer. The topics are more complicated. Everything is more complex because of the research that I cited. So what's not in our curriculum? rich, meaningful, complex text. And in K-2, that is read aloud. The McGuffey Reader may have begun in second grade, but really most of it was second and up. So we don't have that. We don't have, and then again, when I was in elementary school, in the shortly after the Civil War, when you went to social studies class, they plopped down these big, ugly, nasty, boring social studies books. There's no doubt about it. You know, Our World, because in the 5th grade you did the Western Hemisphere. And in the 4th grade, New York State, God, that was beyond boring. But whatever it was complex syntax, and there was a lot of vocabulary. And did you become a historian? No. Did you really understand the nature of historical growth in New York State and what it meant to the rest of the world? Shit, no. But you read a lot of stuff, and you look, if you keep reading page after page, your vocabulary is going to grow, and your ability to deal with longer sentences is going to grow. We don't have that anymore. We either don't have textbooks at all in science and social studies, or we use them so sparingly, and we usually tell the kids what's on there, that it doesn't do any good. So the text being dumbed down is definitely part of this picture. Of course, the problem is if you go back to more complex text, the kids can't read them. And that's something that we'll address today also. Anything else from this table? Steve?
We spoke a little bit to this, the idea of the stamina and the perseverance to getting through, that idea of the complex text. But going to question one, how can text be so clear? And we talked about earlier with the home life and vocabulary. Kids, when they're young and can't get through, what at second grade is a complex text. They don't develop that perseverance that at 5th grade, what is complex at second grade is not complex at 5th grade. They never develop that stamina and perseverance.
Well, right. The problem is, why don't they have the stamina? If they're not fluent, if you're not a fluent reader, if you read like this at this rate from one sentence to the next, you're dying by the time you've reached 4th sentence. But on the other hand, if you are a fluent reader and you don't know what the hell you're reading, that gets pretty boring pretty quickly. So is it really stamina? Or is it really they can't, either they don't have the fluency or they don't understand what they're reading?
With that same idea with a complex sentence, if you're getting to a complex, I'm thinking let's get to high school, and you've got a sentence that lasts a whole paragraph that keeps referring back to itself, holding ideas and getting them back to it. If they don't have that stick-to-itiveness, naturally, then that becomes a ever compounding problem.
Yes, but that's true. But it's also very possible that they blow over. In fact, the research shows they blow over. Our kids don't pay attention to long sentences because they're too long. Turns out they don't pay attention to short sentences either because they figure it's not important. So our kids work on the Goldilocks principle. The sentence has to be just right before they read it.
Which I would have added to that it has to be highly engaging. And I think that if we could get rich, complex text in their hands that they're motivated to read, we get that stamina and that thinking going over maybe the longer sentences because of the motivation. So when I see text, I'm not sure it's geared to their interests with the complexity.
Well,
Curriculum, when you're asking that, it's missing.
The more engaging, the better. Anybody who argues with that is an idiot. But if they're reading at a second grade level and you've got a super engaging 5th grade text, you've got to do something for them to deal with that text. You can't just put it in front of them because it's engaging. Unless, of course, it's a 5th grade text that they happen to know a lot about. We sometimes have a situation where, let's say a kid is fascinated with dinosaurs or horses, and they're a 2nd grade reader based on the basal, but they are fascinated with horses. I'll bet you they could read something that is more complex than 2nd grade about horses. So in that sense, it's true. But if it's a complex text about motorcycles and they don't know anything about motorcycles and they're a 2nd grade reader, they might be interested in motorcycles, but you're going to have to give more support for them to read that text. But engagement is definitely part of the picture here. Anything else from this table?
I what you said about the supports for teachers. I'm going to talk at Chip's going.
Now that she's put you under the gun?
Help me remind me which
Oh, we're saying supports for teachers.
Professional development.
Yeah, just,
to
we
scaffold.
talked about how to guide kids through the text and how to question them appropriately, how to scaffold from, where they are to where they need to be, all the way from I'm behind through I'm enriched. And that, right now, there's different interpretations of the standards. We're all kind of learning to understand them, and some guidance of that, what that standard looks like exemplified.
Okay.
Is missing.
So guidance for what the standards mean. So let's see if that would affect some of this data. This data goes back a quarter of a century, actually a little more. There were no standards a quarter of a century ago.
Right.
And then there were different standards in every state.
Well, that's kind of the point. Like, we haven't been we haven't had a consistent approach across our country of, like, what does it look like to have kids engage with text and to process and to build capacity with it. It's been very skill-based. A lot of, like, do this activity, do that activity, address this skill, in
Oh, okay. Now
isolation.
I
rather
get,
than
right,
thinking in terms
right.
of a continuum. And so that's what's missing. That's what we're saying is
Right.
missing from the curriculum.
That's different. A skill is not exactly the same as a standard, although there's overlap. But that is in fact the case that for the last 25 years, our curriculum has shifted from content to skills rather dramatically. And although each state might have different standards, this was also a problem before there were standards. So that's an interesting question. How much does this emphasis on skills produce this problem? Because if you go back to elementary school and middle school before, like, the mid-1980s, there was much less of an emphasis on skills, much less. The whole standards movement, you know when the standards movement began? In 1985, the National Governors Association got together and said, we got some pretty shitty data here. This state's doing poor, this state's doing poor, this state's doing poor. And one of the governors said, well, what we need is each state needs some standards so we can measure those standards. And that's when the standard movement began. Nobody talked about standards for the whole country, because basically that is unconstitutional. It has to be done voluntarily the way it's done. And this governor came into prominence because he led the National Governors Association and led the movement to create standards. Anybody know who it was? It's Bill Clinton. That was his first appearance on the national scene, was with the National Governors Association when they first made this idea of standards from state to state. And since then, the standards kind of leads to a more skilled-oriented or atomized type of approach, which we'll see is something to talk about. This has been very good. Anything else? Yes?
Just a general question. Is there a correlation between what I would call the real versus the ideal? School systems operate on the basis of the ideal, the Ward and June Cleaver world, if you will.
The what world?
Ward and June Cleaver.
Leave it to Beaver.
Okay? Yeah.
He is really old.
Yeah. You come home and there's June, cookies and milk and all this wonderful stuff, as opposed to something more akin to, even worse than probably what's the one, Married to Children kind of world, where it's very dysfunctional. And we're making the presumption at our level that everything is like Ward and June Cleaver, when in fact that isn't. And so that reinforcement at home isn't occurring. And so that's an outlier here, creating some of that devolution over 25 years.
So the question is, correct me if I'm wrong, what you're saying is, in our curriculum, or somehow in our approach to teaching, we're assuming that kids go home to a stable nuclear family with mom staying home all day, etc. That would be hard to prove one way or the other. I don't have any research. My hunch is that I think most teachers now are pretty much assume that many of their kids don't have that kind of life anymore.
But the system doesn't allow for dealing with it.
I'd have to think about it and how the system works. exactly what the system is doing that assumes this. I mean, you can't. I never count on parents. When in running a school in Harlem for 2 different schools for 15 years, one as an assistant principal. Anytime we did a big parents workshop, the parents who showed up were the ones who needed it the least, and the ones who needed it the most didn't show up. So this is kind of related to what you're saying, but I don't know how many schools really count on parents now. And maybe if they do, I know it's not going to work for the most part.
I mean, we're driven by a bus schedule here.
Right.
At least I know at the high school. I don't have access to the kids that need help after.
And it's hard in rural schools, and it's not much better in urban schools. There's no bus schedule, but parents who need it, as I said, the parents who need it the most tend not to show up. All right, let's go on, and let's take a look at what are not the causes. Because if you eliminate what's not the causes, then you're more likely to land on what are the causes. First, lack of critical thinking. Why might not critical thinking be a problem? Well, first of all, if you Google critical thinking, you'll get 6.2 trillion hits in 0.0009 millionths of a second. We talk about critical thinking. Is anybody who's never heard of critical thinking? Raise your hand if you've never heard of critical thinking. Can we be that freaking bad at it? And then how do you explain the fact that the kids who are proficient readers grow more that the gap increases every year? Are the kids who are not proficient readers somehow not thinking critically, and the kids who are proficient readers thinking more critically? That's number one. So number two. Number one is we talk about it all the time. Could we be so bad at it that we're failing? Number two, it doesn't really explain in any way I can comprehend the gap increasing. But number three, and I think most powerful, kids manage to think critically about what they want to think critically about. They think critically about their sports. They think critically about their art. They certainly think critically about us, and for that matter, each other. So why, when you put them in front of something that's got squiggly black marks that we call letters and words, do they suddenly lose the ability to think critically? And I don't think most of us would have entered into, really, critical thinking, you can't think critically. It's kind of a nice way to say, you're stupid. And I don't think we really believe kids are stupid. I don't think we would have entered into this field if we thought kids are stupid. And there's no evidence that kids are stupid. And the human beings are basically intelligent creatures. And they're not all the same, but they're basically intelligent creatures. So I don't think lack of critical thinking explains this problem. I don't know what happened to my bullets here. Comprehension strategies. How many people have heard of reading comprehension strategies? All right, now reading comprehension strategies are things like asking a question, making an inference, drawing a conclusion, making a connection to yourself, to your life, or making connection to another text, or making connection to the text you're reading, or synthesizing information, or visualizing. Again, drawing a conclusion, making an inference, predicting. What does that sound a lot like? It sounds a lot like critical thinking. Comprehension strategies is pretty much like critical thinking. That's number one. Number two, comprehension strategies came into the education world around, like a gangbuster, around 1995, 1996. So we've been teaching comprehension strategies for about 20 years, and we still have this gap between poor, low-income children and non-low-income children. And we had the gap before we started teaching comprehension strategies, and we had the gap after we started thinking comprehension strategies. Number three, I get on the bus one day. New York City has 36 school districts, each roughly the size of Cleveland. And so my district had principals meetings once a month. They all did. And so they always start at 9 o'clock so you can experience rush hour. And I get on the bus to go to the district meeting, and I sit next to this beautiful little African-American girl, and she's not in school because she was 4 years old probably. School had already started at 8 o'clock. Then she looks up at a sign on the bus, and she says to her mother, "What's that word after no?" And the mother goes, "Spitting." And the girl goes, "Ugh." And then she looks back up at the sign, and says to her mother, "You mean there are some people who need to be told that?" And the mother explains, that there might be some people who need to be told that, and so forth. And then the child looks back up at the sign again. Clearly, this was a Common Core child. She kept returning to the text. So she looks back up at the sign again and says to her mother, "Who put that sign on the bus?" And the mother tries to explain that it wasn't the bus driver, it was the bus driver's boss, and the bus driver's boss, it was the government. But good luck explaining government to a 4-year-old. Good luck explaining government now to anybody. So then the mother explains that, and the child again goes back to the text and says, "I don't think it's going to work, Mom. If they want people to stop spitting, they need to put a policeman on the bus. As a New York City kid, this is not going to work. They need a cop." So let's just go through everything that child did. First, she looked up and she recognized the word that she knows, the word N-O, no, which is considered a comprehension strategy. Then she didn't recognize the next word, spitting. So what did she do? She asked a question, which is also considered a comprehension strategy. Then when the mother said spitting, what did the girl do? Anybody remember? She went what? Ooh, I would bet she was visualizing. Then she goes again, and so we've got asking questions. And then the next thing she says is, "You mean there are some people who need to be told that?" I would say she was making a connection. She knew that in her life, her family didn't go around spitting on buses. So there must be some other people who need to be told that. That's an inference. And then she looks up again, and she asks another question, and then she says it's not going to work. She draws a conclusion. So let's look at what she did. She asked questions, she recognized words, she visualized, she made inferences, she made connections, she synthesized, she drew conclusions, she synthesized that whole thing together. By the way, this would be Bloom's tax, this would be DOK level 3.9 trillion. And she did the whole thing. And she went through absolutely every comprehension strategy, and she was 4 years old. So how much time should we spend teaching comprehension strategies if 4-year-olds have them nailed on their own? Now, I think we should do some. I do believe that there is a role for teaching comprehension strategies. But comprehension strategy, certainly in elementary school, has become the dog and not the tail. And it should be the tail. So that's comprehension strategies, and I think we're missing something here. Failure to master the standards. How does failure to master the standards connect this? Again, this data goes back before there were standards, and this data goes after, and this data was when every state had different standards. So I don't think the standards or failure to master the standards can explain this data. So any questions or thoughts? And I'm going to give you a test soon, so if you want to put the test off as long as possible, you should ask some questions. Anybody? Yes?
The comprehensive strategies make such perfect sense because we have kids that quote them, can tell you how to use them, teach other kids how to use them, and still get test questions wrong.
Right.
So it makes perfect sense when you're saying using the bus analogy. So they've got the strategy.
Right. Now, of course, an interesting question is, in a school that really bears down on the standards and teaches the students what the standard is, do you have the same thing there? Can a kid tell you, this is standard 3 in the 5th grade for reading, but does that mean that they can answer the questions on the test that map to standard 3? And we're going to get back to that. Good point. Yes?
I also think that when they're not comprehending, it's more that they're really not monitoring their thinking.
Wait, say that again.
They're not monitoring their thinking, because they're not even realizing when they're not comprehending the text, that they need to go back and figure out, what was I thinking while I was reading this? So it's not so much the comprehension strategy as the work that goes into comprehension.
Right. That's a good point. It's not so much the strategy itself, it's the metacognitive activity. It's thinking about thinking. The research on strategies is very interesting. There's a meta-study, a study of other studies, a study that looked at like 35 studies about comprehension strategies. And they found some very interesting things. One, they said that you do get somewhat of an improvement in reading scores by teaching comprehension strategies, but it doesn't seem to matter if you teach it 15 minutes a week or if you teach it 3 hours a week. That's a big difference between 15 or 20 minutes and 3 hours. And that's exactly the point. The other part of the research is there doesn't seem to be any difference between teaching the comprehension strategies and asking kids questions about how they got that answer. When you ask a kid a question, well, what did you do? Oh, well, I looked at this word and I thought I knew it, but I didn't. Well, that's a comprehension strategy. Oh, well, I looked at this sentence and I didn't get it, so I looked at the 2 sentences above it and I got it. Well, that's a comprehension strategy. So it turns out that by just ask, which is very related to what you're saying, I think, if you just ask kids, how did you answer that question? You get the same result as making them memorize 10 different comprehension strategies and tell you about it. And you could do that in roughly 15 to 20 minutes a week. So there is a role for that stuff.
Going back to when we're looking at past curriculum that we've had, it was very comprehension. Here's a comprehension strategy. Here's a skill. What's the difference? Teachers were confused between the difference. Then here's a graphic organizer. So you wind up teaching, the kids don't understand a graphic organizer, so you wind up teaching the graphic organizer because you want this in this box, and because you're given, okay, this is what they're supposed to do. Right. So somewhere the whole comprehension, the reason why you're doing that gets lost, and it turned out, okay, do they understand, here's cause and effect, can they fill in what the cause is, what's the effect on the dominoes or the arrows or whatever, so, and that took time away from really letting the kids sit and read and struggle through.
That's so well put. There was another study which I forgot to mention. This is why I ask you to talk so much, because I forget so much. Isabel Beck and Beck and McCown, that a lot of you might know from vocabulary, did an amazing study for 2 years. They compared 3 groups. One group that worked on a basal, that just followed the basal, which is mostly comprehension strategies, like your basals. Another group that didn't have a basal, but did a complete comprehension strategies approach. And another group did what Beck called a content approach. That means, well, what is the text saying here? What's happening? Why did this happen? Really text-dependent questions, but she called it content. 2-year study, 30 or 40 fifth grade classes. What was totally predictable, which is a comprehension strategy, it was totally predictable that the content group did better. The basal group even did better than the group that just did comprehension strategies. But what was most stunning, and you should Google this study if you get a chance, it's called Rethinking Comprehension Instruction. Isabel Beck. You'll just Google it and you'll get it. You have my email, and you will on the PowerPoint, and I'd be glad to send it to you if you don't have, but I don't think you'll have any trouble. She then went in and they recorded the conversations of the teachers and the students. So in the comprehension class, there would be a question. They were reading a story by Ray Bradbury, and they would say, well, what did so-and-so say about the television? And the kid was stumped. And the teacher would say, can you make an inference? And the kid would look up, it was different? Next kid, can you make an inference? And then repeated it. And then in the other study, what was different about the television? Kid doesn't know. Well, can you look at that next paragraph? Can you read that again? Did they say something about the television show there? Oh, I get it. In the old days, teachers were real people. Now, teachers are all on television. So the questions were all going right back to the text. Because of what you said, we've moved so far away. What's the skill? You don't understand the skill? Well, we'll do a graphic organizer. You've left the text in the dust weeks ago, and 2 things happen. The text gets lost, but you know what else? The kids get freaking bored. Because skills are not as interesting as what's going on in a text. It's much more interesting, well, you mean that this was a Ray Bradbury story that took place in the future. You mean, which is a kid going to be more interested? You mean these kids don't have real human beings as teachers? What do you do if you have to go to the bathroom? Does the television tell you whether or not you can? They were much more interested in the idea that in the future there would be no live teachers than they were in making an inference or drawing a conclusion. And how many kids go home and say, what did you do today? Oh, we made some inferences. You want to hear them? You know, it's freaking boring. We've not only developed systems that don't work, but they're boring too. They're anything but engaging. It doesn't matter if you have the most engaging text in the world. I go into schools and they're reading out loud to kindergarten children, a wonderful book, and every paragraph the teacher stops and says, we're doing characters' traits. Can you tell me another trait? And you see the kids go like this. They're in kindergarten. They want to hear the freaking story. It's not, it's not like they read the story once or twice and now they're going to go back and say, well, what were the traits that made this mouse brave? And the kids have absorbed the story. They knew how it ended. No, they spent 5 days on a 10 or 15 page story because they stop every paragraph and say, can you make character traits? And so that's that. I don't know what else to say about that. We stopped for lunch at 11:30. So I'm going to go straight through. Where's Vanessa? I'm going to go straight through to 11:30. Is that okay with you? And then, and because you've got a quiz coming up, unless someone else comes up with another question or comment, we're going to have a quiz in a minute. All right, ready? Quick quiz. Which is harder? You should have in front of you. It should be in front of you. Everybody see it? Restate the following sentence in your own words, and I'll put it up here if you don't have it. You've got question 1 and question 2, and your questions are on the bottom. And I put question. Everybody got it? You have to do this even if you teach high school history. Oh, okay.
We had a discussion about the actual question for number 1 is easier because it's just saying to restate something, but the text that you have to restate from is a lot harder, so it makes that question harder.
Okay, so the question was easier, but the answer was harder. Yeah. Okay, so question 1 was easier. Anybody feel that question 1 was harder, rather? Anybody feel that question 2 was harder? No one?
The task was harder, the text was easier.
Task was harder, text was easier. All right, so we all agree that question 2 was easier. And of course, a lot of people recognize from Charlotte's Web, right?
Right.
When I grow up, or in my next life, I want to be able to either write as well as E.B. White or play shortstop as well as Derek Jeter. Because it didn't work out that way in this life. Why was the second question easier? Anybody want to take a shot at that? I think you all got it on some level, so why?
But you also have that background knowledge. We've read Charlotte's Web, so when you read that, and then it goes into, and then you have background knowledge about defending animal rights, and I mean,
Okay, so question 2 was easier for us because we've all got that background knowledge. We've read. Well, is there anybody who's not read Charlotte's Web? Did you find question 2 still easier?
Yeah.
Right. Anybody else who's not read Charlotte's Web? Should we feed him to the alligator? All right. Yeah, if you've never read Charlotte's Web, what about to a 3rd grader? Which would be
Because the text is easier, because they're relating, she's an 8-year-old, you might have had some kind of experience with animals, that's a big thing for kids that are 8, so it's that engagement with that text, that's easier to understand.
Okay, so the second question has more engagement. Well, let's stick with adults, even though we've all read Charlotte's Web, except for this guy. We have some background knowledge. The text is easier. Would a lesson or a whole week of lessons on finding the main idea or making inferences help us understand the first text? The first text, if you take a look at the text, it's obvious the first text, which I wouldn't even read out loud because I can't pronounce all the words correctly. The first text required some knowledge of the discipline of philosophy, which I don't know if anybody took Philosophy 101, but I considered it a great success of my undergraduate years that I did not. The first text required specialized vocabulary that we don't know, required some understanding of philosophy that some of us might have if we took philosophy, or that didn't. But the Bloom's taxonomy level for the first question was really like minus 26. Restate it in your own words. The Bloom's taxonomy, or DOK, for the second question was 1.3 trillion. Look what you had to do. You're asking the reader to make an inference about the character's values from her behavior. Then you're asking to transpose. You're saying, well, this is what Fern, the character, this is what Fern felt about animals. This is her behavior. So from her behavior, I can make an inference about her values about this pig or the runt. But I have to make a double inference. I have to say, well, this is what she feels about the runt, but this is what she feels about all animals. So I have to make an inference going from a specific animal to a whole class called animals. Then I have to be able to explain those values and I have to understand those values, integrate them into my understanding, and then defend those values. But I have to defend those values for a very special kind of writing, letter to the editor. So I have to think, well, what's writing to an editor like in a newspaper? And then I have to think, what's the audience like who reads the letter to the editor? So I have to do a series of complex cognitive tasks. That is, as I said, a DOK level of 1.3 trillion. As opposed to just restate it in my own words. And this is an example of why critical thinking or reading strategies does not cause the problem. If you're reading something that you can make sense out of because you have some knowledge of what an animal is, what a farm is, even if you didn't know what a runt is, it's defined. It says the smallest one that was born or something like that. So if you have this knowledge and you know the words, then a very complex activity is much easier than if you don't know it. And I've now done this in about 5 or 6 different 8th grade classes, where I've had teachers do just this assignment for Charlotte's Web, and they used the 8th grade standards. And all of a sudden, all the kids mastered them. They had no problem with the 8th grade standards, even those kids who were reading at a 3rd grade level, because Charlotte's Web is at a 3rd grade level. So they could demonstrate their mastery of an 8th grade standard as long as the text was accessible to them. Questions or comments on that or any part of that? Okay. If critical thinking, strategies, and standards are not the causes, then what are the causes? You want to know? You sure? Vocabulary, failure to grow sufficient vocabulary, which your questions, which your responses already touched on. Failure to grow sufficient vocabulary. Knowledge, failure to develop wide background knowledge. Now, I'm capable of any kind of typing or proofreading error, but that's deliberate that I crossed out background. Why do you think I crossed out background and instead just left knowledge? Failure to develop wide knowledge.
You need more than just your background. You need more than just your background.
You definitely, and those kids who don't have much background need a lot more. We can't control background knowledge. That's kind of like, there are some some efforts, and you may have read them, where districts or states try to send books home for parents to read to their children or encourage parents to do this. None of them have shown any success. None of them. 0.
So what would you say is the difference between background and wide knowledge?
Background is what the kids come to us with.
Okay.
From their background, from their ground, their life outside of school, their life before they came to school. Affluent children go away on summer trips, go to summer camps, fly on airplanes. Their parents take them to museums. Their parents read to them. Their parents ask them questions and then encourage the children to make inferences and so forth. We can't control all that. We can't control that they come in with so much less background knowledge. But we can control how much knowledge do we give them. How much is our curriculum oriented towards growing knowledge? I think you would agree that, and it's something we'll talk about, that certainly before the standards, growing knowledge was not something that we talked about a lot in ELA curriculum. We didn't even talk about it that much in any other curriculum. We talked more about skills and standards and not growing knowledge. So background knowledge is what the kids come to us with and what they get when they go home. And I'm making the claim that that's hard for us to control.
Correct, so the wide knowledge would be the knowledge that we give them when they're with us,
Ex-
that they can carry forward.
Exactly, exactly. Any other questions or comments? That was a helpful question. Okay, so 1, vocabulary. 2, knowledge. 3, fluency. Failure to become a fluent reader. Now, that, again, related to what was said over here, you can't make a claim for every school in America. Some schools make kids completely fluent readers, but develop absolutely no knowledge. And it's another one of the both-ands examples. So we're going to go into each of these separately in some detail, unless there's any other questions at this point. But we're going to go into each of these 3, vocabulary, knowledge, and fluency. Let's take a close look at each, starting with vocabulary. This is almost 100 years of research. If you take a look at the first bullet, 100 years of research. There's not even any people around anymore who are named Whipple. There's no Whipples here, are there? We got 100 years. Unfortunately, I did this at a large group in New York State with 200 teachers, and finally there was a Whipple. But he took it very well. He didn't feel he was related to this guy. So we have 100 years of research connecting vocabulary to knowledge, to vocabulary to reading comprehension. 100 years. It's the feature of complex text that likely causes the greatest difficulty. Remember I said that my wife and I, mostly my wife, were responsible for running the experiment to show what's the right Lexile level at 4th grade, what's the right Lexile level in 6th grade. The way we did that was we went online and we got 1,368 state test passages that were retired. It's very easy to get. All you got to do is Google Florida retired state tests, Alabama retired state tests, and you get them all. And we had the people from Metametrics who analyzed text, and other groups did the same thing, and they analyzed the vocabulary. But they also had the scores on those tests. They didn't have the kids' names or anything, but we had the information for the scores. And sure enough, as the vocabulary becomes more difficult, the scores go down in 1,368 tests. Lexile, when they've been making Lexiles, they've had that data for almost 30 years now. You give kids something to read, and you test them, the more difficult the vocabulary, the lower the test score, the lower the score on that passage. Having determined the meaning of too many words slows you up. And it not only slows you up, it's debilitating, it's frustrating. I get pissed off on my Kindle when I get a word that I don't know, and all I have to do is put my finger on it. And it gets to, the thing, Kindle gives you the definition. And there's not that many that adults don't usually know, depending on what you're reading. But if you're a kid and you can't just put your finger on it, after a while it gets frustrating if there's word after word that you don't know. It's like you're constantly being told that you're missing something, because we're supposed to know the meaning of words. The 30 million word gap was the study that I mentioned before. And with the less affluent children hearing so much less words. So vocabulary is intimately tied to reading comprehension. But think about, there's this thing called elevator speeches, which comes from the business world, where you're supposed to tell, in what the time it takes you on an elevator, you're supposed to be able to tell why you've made the world's greatest brownie and are going to make a fortune on it, and how it's different than the other brownies that have been made, or Cocoa Crisps or whatever. And that's called an elevator speech. If you ask people to do their elevator speech in their literacy program, how many do you think talk about vocabulary? They talk about comprehension strategies. They talk about basal readers. They talk about leveled readers. They talk about ability groups. They talk about the standards. And chances are they don't mention vocabulary. Yet we have 100 years of research connecting vocabulary. I didn't define the first bullet. The NAEP research, National Assessment of Educational Progress, the federal test that all of us take, that certain groups, it comes out to hundreds of thousands of kids. statistically taken from each different state. They did a study just recently, 2013. They took about half of the kids, half of the hundreds of thousands of kids, and they gave them a separate vocabulary test. In addition to the regular reading test that they always give them, the kids who scored in the bottom quartile on the reading test scored in the bottom quartile on the vocabulary test. The kids who scored in the top quartile on the reading test scored in the top quartile on the vocabulary test, and the two quartiles in between. One of the researchers said, only half jokingly, why do we bother with all these reading tests? You just give them a vocabulary test, and for all practical purposes, you get the same result. So that's 100 years of research, and yet it doesn't get nearly the attention it deserves. Let me say this one thing before I forget. I always forget it. There's an amazing book written by a group of teachers in Louisville, Kentucky, Jefferson County, Kentucky, called Word Nerds. It's just a book, and it has it's for elementary school. It has hundreds of fun activities for elementary school kids to do to learn words. And what it does is, it's amazing to see. I've seen the videos. The kids become word nerds. They like every word that comes up in their life, they want to know about it. And they compare it to other words. And it was written by teachers, full-time teachers, and it's a book called Word Nerds.
Sorry to keep asking questions.
That's okay.
In the beginning, when you talked about the ACT, you said that the vocabulary portion the kids scored the same on, and that wasn't a component of
Because,
the higher score.
good question. That's a very good question. When the text was not that complex, then everybody could do the vocabulary and context question. But when the text was complex, the kids who scored below the benchmark were lost. They couldn't do it. Any other questions on vocabulary? Finally, what we can say is, after much research, we've determined that reading has a great deal to do with words. Okay, so that's the importance of vocabulary. This is, I know you don't take the SBAC and Park, but this is, I'm using the SBAC and Park. These were from grade 3 on the SBAC and Park test. Now, the point is, for both SBAC and Park, they tried to make the text third grade complexity. So you had a group of 20 people who made sure it was the right lexile, and they looked at it qualitatively. So it's not so much the test, but it's that people picked this as a third grade text. Two passages. Look at this and think about your third graders. How many of these words would your third graders know? If you teach high school, think how many of your high school kids might know what blossom means, or pitch, as in pitch and sound. Okay, what do you think? How would your third graders do? How many of your third graders could give you a rough sense? Any response of how many of your third graders could give you a rough sense of what most of these words mean? Or if you teach older grades, how many of your middle school kids could give you a rough sense of what some of these words mean? None?
Yeah, they would not.
Middle school.
Yeah, they would have difficulty with like nifty, scorched, fraying, definitely.
All right, so you feel that your middle school kids would have trouble with a lot of them.
What I think is hopeful, though, is that there are a lot of science content words, and if you're good at teaching content with your social studies and science, these words come into play quite frequently.
If you teach it.
If you're
teaching science.
Yes.
Because a lot of elementary schools in our country have dropped science because they want to have more time to teach skills in reading. But yes, you're right, and that's a very important point.
If you pick a really good read aloud that's science or social studies driven, you're going to end up with some of these words. If you've done read aloud in K1 and 2, and you've read aloud about farms, and you've read aloud about habitats or ecosystems, you're going to get words like crops and nutrients and spouting and maybe even blossom. And you know what? If you know some, that gives you the support to learn the others. We talk about vocabulary and context as a skill. When they've studied which students do better in determining vocabulary from context, what they found out is the kids who do better in vocabulary and context are the kids who know more what? More words.
the more words you know, because what's the context? The context is the other words. So if you've never heard of nutrients, but you know what crops are, you know what spouting is, you know what blossoms are, you have a chance to figure out what nutrients are. But if you've never heard of any of them, you can't do it. No test is written such that it expects every child to know every single word. The point is you have to know a certain number of words to figure out what the other words mean. And if you don't have that, you can't do it. Any other responses? Anybody teach third grade or second or fourth? What are your any thoughts?
I mean, I think there would be words that we would see in our text that we're reading now. I mean, Charlotte's Web is one of our texts.
And you'd have some of them. But what about the whole building? Filtered, scarred, pitch?
Well, in context, if they were just being tested on the words on their own, they would all kind of probably not do so well. But in context, then the context, like I said, is the other words. Right.
And if there's too many of the other words they don't know, there's no doubt context is better than just giving it to them. But your context is your other words, so if there's too many of those you don't know, then you can't figure out the new ones.
All at that level. Classic kids, your top 25 percentile kids will know them all. Your average reader is going to know about half, and your lowest 25 is really going to struggle with it.
Right. And that's one of the reasons the lowest 25 stay in the lowest 25. If the more words you know, remember I said in the beginning that proficient readers, the gap between proficient readers and non-proficient readers increases every year? Take a minute, do a turn and talk. How does what we're talking about now explain that? How does what we just started to talk about with determining words in context and what words you know, how does that help explain the fact that the gap between proficient readers and non-proficient readers expands every grade? Do a quick turn into a level. And you give them text, and there's words in their third grade text that they don't know the meaning of, but they know the other words, so they learn the new words that they don't know the meaning of. The kid who's reading at a late first grade level or a second grade level doesn't know as many of those words, so he doesn't learn as many of those words. So the kid who's at grade level learns more words every year. But then he goes into fourth grade, and the gap increases. And so vocabulary is definitely a huge part of explains the data. The data is that the gap increases. Vocabulary shows one major reason why. The next major reason why works exactly the same way. Knowledge. We have research on knowledge that goes the same way with vocabulary, about 15, almost 20 years of research. And knowledge is tier 3 vocabulary. References to topics that students know. So if you take a look at the topics here, the first one on the left is Babe Ruth. That's not from a passage about baseball. That's from a passage about a girl growing up. But they mention Babe Ruth. If you happen to know who Babe Ruth is, then that'll help you learn more. On the other column, animal mating. If you've never heard of animal mating, you've never studied it, then it's going to be harder for you to learn something. Knowledge, and then it goes down for gills, animal traits, native peoples, Alaska. Remember, with the Common Core, half the text students read is supposed to be what? Informational text. Informational text has to be about something. It's going to be about science or social studies or the arts. So the more kids know about science or social studies or the arts, the better they're going to do. Well, with reading first, we kind of wiped that out of the elementary school curriculum. We concentrated either on foundational skills and not this, it wasn't both and, or we concentrated on skills and standards, and instead of, like when old people like me and Mr. Alligator over there were in school, and you had an hour a day of social studies, and an hour a day of science. How many of your schools have 5 days a week, an hour of social studies and an hour of science in elementary school? Anybody? There's no time because they're doing skills. The problem is that you can learn to read, reading about animals and reading about explorers and reading about Native Americans and reading about wars. We don't do that, though, in elementary school. We probably don't do it much in middle school or high school either, but we certainly don't do it in elementary school. So the more you know, the better reader you are. Knowledge and vocabulary climb up together. There are very few ignoramuses who have widely developed vocabularies. And there are very few people with minimal vocabularies who know a great deal about the world. Because it turns out that knowing about the world is the best way to learn vocabulary, as we'll see. This was an interesting study. This is not done because I happen to be a huge baseball fan, but they did a study, and they took, with baseball, and they took kids who were low readers and kids who were high readers, but they also found out by testing them which kids knew a lot about baseball and which didn't. And what it turned out was the kids who were third grade readers, but were in the 8th grade, who knew more about baseball, did just as well on the test as the kids who were strong readers but didn't know anything about baseball. What I'm getting at is, it turns out that knowledge about baseball predicted the scores on the passage better than their reading ability. And this study was replicated with soccer in Europe. But it's the same thing if you're reading a text about habitats, about animals, about discoveries, about museums, about beaches, about seagulls, about birds. How much knowledge you have determines how well you will read that text. And this has been documented time and time again. But again, think of our elevator speech. When you ask people to talk about their literacy program, how many talk about knowledge, about growing knowledge?
Just an interesting aside, I had been doing some professional development at my school about this knowledge industry. And what came up and turned into like a huge thing was, well, but knowledge for blooms is the lowest taxonomy. And they were so hung up on that. Well, they're not synthesizing, they're not doing this, they're not evaluating. And it was a difficult conversation, but just to say, just that wide knowledge of understanding a whole lot of different things is going to help them.
Exactly,
So
exactly.
That's where the teachers are, a lot of them.
Now, a lot. Raise your hand if you know a child, either from your professional life as educators or your personal life, who read everything they can get their hands on about tractors or dinosaurs or hunting or whatever. If you know any one child like that, raise your hand. High, please. Oh, that's a lot. Hands down. If, and this could be true, so did the child you're thinking of or the children you're thinking of, did any of them fail the reading test? 1, 2, 3. So almost everybody raised their hand and 3 failed the reading test. It's almost indisputable. A child who reads a ton about a topic, not just Captain Underpants, but a child who reads a ton about a topic. How does the kid who's reading everything they can get their greasy hands on about ATVs, very popular in Vermont, I don't know about here, or snowmobiles, probably not so popular here. How does a kid who reads everything they can get their hands on about horses or dinosaurs or costumes or whatever, what are they doing that prepares them for the reading test? 2 things. When you read everything you can about horses, you're not just learning about horses. You're learning about agriculture, you're learning about how to care for animals, you're learning about people's attitude towards animals, you're learning a whole lot of stuff, not just horses. But here's the real ringer. Research shows that when you read a group of texts about one topic or related topics, you learn 4 times as many Tier 2 academic words as when you're reading novels or you jump around from topic to topic. So what that means is, if you read 7 or 8 texts about sea mammals, you're learning 4 times as much vocabulary as if you're reading a novel, or if one day sea mammals, the next day tree kangaroos, the next day explorers. And it kind of makes sense, because if you're reading 7 or 8 texts about sea mammals, then you're becoming an expert on sea mammals. So when you come across a word like depth, or volume, or atmosphere, or oxygen, they could be about anything. You have the knowledge about sea mammals that prepares you to learn that word. So we have a great irony here. The best way to learn, the best way to become a proficient reader is to read a lot about the world, to read continually about topics. We don't do that. We've moved completely away from that.
So then, this is where I'm a little confused, because probably my highest scores on a standardized test are my most proficient readers, but they're probably in third grade reading mostly novels. I mean, they're fiction lovers. So they're 24/7 grabbing, and they like series, so they might read 27 from the same author. But I don't see them really delving.
That's a good point. It'll work up till the 3rd and 4th grade, and here's why. We don't have time for the big test. You missed the whole test. I'm not sure why that, well, I don't know why that went dead, but it doesn't matter. All right, quick question. Raise your hand when you thought of the wisest, smartest person who ever lived on the planet Earth. And volunteer one person you think. Raise your hand, don't call out. Anybody can pick anyone. Smartest, wisest person who lived on the planet Earth. Stephen Hawking. You didn't raise your hand, but Stephen Hawking.
I yelled at him.
That's okay. Well, the alligator will take care of you. Stephen Hawking. Next one. Einstein. Stephen Hawking and Einstein go into a bar. They're not talking about physics. They're not talking science at all, which is their specialty, right? But they're talking about politics, or they're talking about families, or food, or women. What's the vocabulary level of their discussion? Is it like graduate school, 8th grade? What's the vocabulary level of their discussion? What do we got?
Graduate school.
Graduate school? Do I hear postgraduate school? What did you say?
Doctorate.
I hear graduate school, doctorate. Do I hear postdoctorate?
Yeah.
College?
In a bar?
I'm
just.
What?
Doesn't it depend on the conversation?
Any topic other than science. All right, I heard 8th grade. It's exactly 5.5. It's been studied time and time again. When people talk, they use simple words. We don't talk and use words like perseverate, iconoclastic, onomatopoeia, or whatever that is. We don't use words like that when we talk, and the chances are, anybody who does, you don't want to talk to them. We use simple words when we talk. And this has been studied. When they actually did transcripts of people in trials, in juries, in businesses, psychologists record the conversation and then do an analysis of the vocabulary level, and it comes out to 5.5, except Congress. Congress came out lower. So if you're going to learn vocabulary after the 5th grade, you don't learn it from watching television, but you don't learn it from novels either. Because what are novels about? They're about people. And they talk to each other, and they don't use these words. So the only way that you can grow this vocabulary after the 5th to 6th grade is if you read informational text. This is the research that went into the standards. Remember I said that was my job. This is the research, and this is why the standards say 50% informational text. Because it's true. If a kid reads every novel they can get their grubby little hands on, that is a good thing. But if after elementary school, that's not going to do it. Your questions are really, really helpful. That's not going to do it after elementary school.
So we should cultivate that then, like try to cultivate them, and even find a few topics in nonfiction that they love.
Yes, as much as you can. Independent reading, free choice reading should really be free choice reading, not free choice novels. Any school I've gone into and I said, look, put out the magazines. You know those magazines like Sports Illustrated and motorcycle magazines and hunting magazines? They're way more complicated than novels. And boys tend to like them more than novels. They should be in the classroom. You know what? Even comic books have more sophisticated vocabulary than children's literature. So why not, I mean, as long as they're not too violent and too much sex, why not read that as well? This is also why, if you're not fluent, you're dead. Because if you're not fluent, you're not going to learn from vocabulary or knowledge from the books you read. Because if you're not fluent, only two things are going to happen. You're going to only read simple books, usually simple novels. And if someone makes you read more complex books, you can't read them if you're not fluent, so you don't learn the vocabulary and you don't learn the knowledge. So vocabulary and knowledge explain the data. The data is that proficient readers move ahead at a faster pace every year. The only way you can explain that is not because of skills, not because of standards, but because of knowledge and vocabulary. Proficient readers get more knowledge. So when they get to something like this, when they read about native peoples, they're not sure what native peoples are, but they know what Alaska is. And maybe they know what the Smithsonian is, so they can figure out what native peoples are. The not proficient reader doesn't have that knowledge. So the proficient reader has more knowledge, and his knowledge grows more knowledge. The not proficient reader has less knowledge, so he grows more knowledge at a slower rate every year. It's knowledge and vocabulary, not skills, that explain it. But if we continually focus, A, on skills, B, on comprehension strategies, and C, on the standards, and we break the standards down especially, and this week we're doing this standard, and next week we're doing that standard, then where does knowledge come? When do we focus on building knowledge? Student Achievement Partners is making something called tech set projects. We're putting together from around the country, we're getting teachers to make a tech set on sea mammals, on explorers, on farmers, 7 or 8 texts. Some of them full-length texts, some of them online texts for free. And teachers around the country are making these text sets, putting them on our website, Student Achievement Partners. And by the fall, we expect to have possibly as many as 100 of these text sets. We also go around the country and make them with people. So, Vanessa, if you could get us to come here in the fall, because we're booked for the summer, and if you can get at least 100 people, then we will work with you on how to make these text sets. You can make text sets that are connected to your social studies and science standards, or you can just make fun ones, like grossology, which is the most popular text set for 4th grade, all about gross. The next most popular is zombies. So you can make text sets like that kids will find really engaging, like you said, engaging. Zombies are very engaging. Or you can make text sets about your standards in social studies and science if you have those kinds of standards. So we've done this, we're doing it in Oregon in the summer. We're doing it in Milwaukee. The Milwaukee one is full. But we get together over 100 people, and it would be fine to come here in September. We would love it. Come here in September, and you can contact me, and then I'll put you in charge of the connection with the person who does that. I think we're winding up because I know you're going. You missed the test. You didn't get a chance to do the test, but you can give yourself the test. Basically, what I did on the test was we blacked out all the words that 3rd graders are not likely to know, and then you can take the test as if you were a 3rd grader and you didn't know those words, and see how you do. This is interesting. This is from a principal, and I get these letters, I would say, about 2 or 3 times a week, just like this. We continue to struggle with the gaps in vocabulary development and background knowledge when students engage in close reading of a complex passage. We continue to model and assist students navigating through complex informational and fictional text and hope that the efforts will help them carry skills to the next piece of text they encounter. It won't. We should do close reading. If you don't do close reading, how are you going to teach complex text? If you're in the 4th grade, if you're in the 6th grade, and you give kids a text at a 6th grade level, and you've got kids reading at a 2nd or 3rd grade level, you've got to do close reading. You've got to have multiple reads text-dependent questions, chunk the text, provide support. And you do that all year, and then you say, okay, we've been doing this for a year, or we've been doing this for 2 years, as with this principle, but when I put a complex text in front of the kids and I ask them to read that independently, they still can't do it. Of course not, because the only way they're going to be able to do it independently is if they've grown the vocabulary knowledge and the topic knowledge to do it. You may have done a lot of close reading, and you're asked to do a text about lobster fishing, and you know you're not sure what a lobster is, and you've never read anything with fishing. And then there's 10 academic words that you don't know the meaning of. You might have all kinds of skills. You know you need to sometimes connect one part of the text to another. You need to know you're supposed to stop when you don't understand something. You need to know you're supposed to break longer sentences down. That skill knowledge will help you. There's no doubt about it. But if there's too many words you don't know the meaning of, and the topic is totally foreign to you, though you will not be able to exercise those skills. The only way we can reach standard 10, complex text, independently and proficiently, is if we find a way to build knowledge and build vocabulary. The bad news, there's bad news and good news. I'll give you the bad news first. The bad news is anybody who says that we can take our kids and make them proficient readers with more complex text in 1 or 2 years is either an idiot or a liar or both. This is going to take more than 1 or 2 years. There's no way it's going to happen in 1 or 2. If they're proficient already, maybe it'll take 1 or 2 years to move them up to more complex text. But think 5 to 10 years, not 1 or 2. That's the bad news. The good news, it's more fun to learn about the world, and it's more engaging than it is to learn about skills and inferences and standards. That's the good news. So I'm going to finish up. I am finishing. You've been, and I'll take any final questions because we end pretty soon. So any final questions or final thoughts or anything I said that pissed anybody off for real? There's been some really good questions here.
I guess what I'm left with is I agree with everything you're saying. But with the curriculum and all the different subjects that are kind of presented by teachers, because we've got to get them done.
You're talking about elementary school?
Yes.
Or?
It seems like a more integrated approach and a more unit-based approach, which was something that was tried and then ditched in the whole language era. It seems like we're going back to that, but in a richer way. How do we start implementing this in our curriculum now?
All right, good, very good question on a number of levels. First of all, to answer it correctly, whole language did not do topics. Whole language did themes. Okay. What's the difference between a theme?
And a unit.
Right.
Okay.
A topic would be sea mammals or explorers.
Right.
A theme would be courage or friendship. Doesn't do the same thing. You read a story about two boys in China who are friends. That doesn't give you the knowledge to then read a story about 3 girls in San Francisco who are friends. Topics do.
Right.
So that's a huge difference. Secondly, you're right. It's not going to be easy. But the only way we're going to grow knowledge and vocabulary is if we teach kids about the world. It's not going to happen any other way. There was a guy named John Guthrie who wrote these programs called Concept-Oriented Reading Instruction. Are you familiar with it? Remarkable. CORI, C-O-R-I, Concept-Oriented Reading Instruction. He did topic-based literacy programs for years. His whole career was devoted to this. And lo and behold, he studied it very carefully. He's a researcher. And the students who did these topic-based approaches scored higher on standardized reading tests consistently than the kids who did the basals, or the kids who did the themes, or the kids who did Fontes and Pinnell. They outscored them all the time. So yeah, we can't go right away to a topic, to an integrated approach, but we can start bringing knowledge back through things like the text sets. Here's something we can do right away. Not only can we do it right away, but it costs almost nothing. In grades K and 2, do 60 minutes a day of read aloud. But that 60 minutes should include science and social studies. Get 5 books on whales and read them out loud to your students. Then when they're done, get 5 books on Native Americans and read them out loud. Then get 5, it doesn't cost much because you only need 5 books. You don't have to buy a whole class set and read aloud. That will start catching up vocabulary and world knowledge right away, and that's something everybody can do. We have something on our website called the Read Aloud Project, RAP, that will help get you started on that. How many people know ReadWorks? ReadWorks came from the curriculum at our school that my wife and I started. And ReadWorks has, at this point, thousands of informational texts. So you could kind of make your own text set with ReadWorks by getting 5 texts on global warming or something. There's a similar reading. How many people know Reading A to Z? ReadWorks is free. Reading A to Z is so cheap, it might as well be free. Plus, you can cheat and share the license. There's something called News. I didn't say that. There's something called, I'm from New York. There's something called News ELA. How many people know News ELA? Very cool. Current topics like ISIS, fracking, etc., at different levels of complexity. So start bringing knowledge of the world back into elementary school, and even in high school with literature. One of my favorite units, an English teacher was teaching Romeo and Juliet right when the standards began. He said, David, how am I going to add informational text to Romeo and Juliet? I said, well, why don't you try something on tribalism? Or how about raging hormones? I don't think Romeo and Juliet would be about two 40-year-olds. So he went out, he did some research, he found a whole bunch of texts, complex informational text on raging hormones, and he made a whole new unit. Romeo and Juliet, does it always have to end this badly? And you know what else he found out? A lot of the kids, especially the boys, had it after 7 weeks with Romeo and Juliet. There's a limit on how far they're going to go with Romeo and Romeo, wherefore art thou? But the raging hormones and the tribalism, they were all interested in it, and it really enhanced it. Nobody ever thought of, could this happen with two 45-year-olds? So bring informational text like that into your high school literature classes on a regular basis. We all want primary sources, and we should work with kids through close reading to read primary sources. But they've also got to read something at lower levels in history that they can understand. So make a text set for high school on whatever topic you're doing, which has lower level complex texts, so kids can start to develop that knowledge of words and the world. So there are things that can be done without making wholesale changes. I think you've adopted ReadyGen in elementary school, right? ReadyGen does have these additional texts. I don't know them intimately. I am going to do a review, and we're hiring some of our core advocates to do a review of ReadyGen in the next few weeks. So you guys would be ideal, some of you. I'll recommend you. You get a free trip to New York. And they might even pay you, but that's up to Student Achievement Partners. But ReadyGen does have these additional texts. Did you order them? Yes. All right. Take a look at these additional texts. I know they're at different levels of complexity, right? They might be ideal for building knowledge. What I'm hoping ReadyGen did was if the text that everybody read is, let's say, about mountain climbing, then the little texts, I'm hoping, are also somehow connected to mountain climbing. That's perfect. But use it to develop knowledge. Don't worry about the skills. Don't even worry about the freaking standards. Did I say that? Deal with the standards on the anchor text, the complex text that everybody reads. That's where you deal with the standards, the close reading. If you've got the 5th grade and you've got to read a text that's like really 3 years above everybody's level, and you're going to spend a lot of time on that, that's where you deal with the standards. And that's where you deal with the skills. But you make sure the kids understand the text. But those little texts, that should be mostly kids reading on their own. And you know what happens? If they know a lot about mountain climbing, they're going to be able to read those little texts more on their own. And your questions and your activities should be all about mountain climbing, what the kids are learning about in mountain climbing. You don't even have to worry about the vocabulary in those texts unless you need to give some of it to kids, because we know that if kids are reading something they understand, we know their vocabulary grows. So we don't have to test it. We don't have to butcher it. Concentrate on the topic, because that way their knowledge of words will grow and their knowledge of the world will grow. And it'll be more interesting for the teachers and for the kids. So if ReadyGen has that, and I have not reviewed it yet, but if ReadyGen has that, even if it's not great, even if it's just good, that's way better than the other programs. The other programs don't really have that. So you might have kind of stumbled into the right one. Or maybe you knew that, I don't know. But you got it at any rate. But don't butcher it with skills and don't butcher it with standards. Do the skills and the standards just with the anchor grade level complex text. And with the smaller text, just read, ask questions, and talk about what's fun and what's interesting for the kids. And throw in some videos. Whatever it is, mountain climbing, eagles, there's free videos for all of that now. Build that in. Anything else? All right, you've been really fun to work with. Thank you very much.